a lot of time looking for seats, which I have to say I'm very happily impressed with such the interest in this topic, and we're certainly going to try to address those concerns and give you guys an opportunity to talk about these issues if you want to. First and foremost, just to introduce myself, I recognize many of the Hofstra noses and eyes out there from students that I've taught over the last couple of years. But I'm Professor Mark Niles here from Hofstra, and Professor, colleague of mine and very good friend James Sample. We are going to be providing the presentation today. And basically, the title of the presentation is what the presentation is going to be. Really two questions. First, what is critical race theory? And second, why is it the thing that everyone seems to be talking about for the first time in 30 years since its inception? And I'm going to pretty much handle the first part, and Professor Sample is going to pretty much handle the second part. It'll be a little overlap, I guess, but that's basically what I'm planning. I want to start out, again, by welcoming everybody and saying this is an event, a program that was designed and put on by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, actually Council of the Law School, and I'm co-chair of that with Dean Monticello, who's there at the front, making sure everything's going all right. And also co-sponsored by several student organizations, including APALSA, BALSA, WALSA, and Outlaw. So I want to thank all of those student organizations and your leadership for participating in this. We really appreciate it. So for me, the idea, at least, of doing something like this started when, as I said, critical race theory began to be such a big topic, a hot topic in the news. And I thought it might be interesting for law students who don't necessarily know or want to be able to answer the question, so what exactly is critical race theory and what impact does it have? And for me, it actually had a much more personal component because critical race theory played a huge part in my law school experience. And so you guys are all law students now, or all of you here are law students, and I thought you might be somewhat interested in the way that this development affected me and affected a lot of people who were in law school at my time and a lot of the people in the generation of your law professors. So I'm going to talk a little bit personally. I'm reminded by people who know me that everything isn't about me, and I got to remember that. But this time, it's a little bit about me. I want to talk a little bit about that. I think it might make this sort of connection to this a little bit more personal and therefore more interesting to this. So there'll be a little bit of that. Okay, so start with the big question, short answer. So what is critical race theory? So in its inception, at least, critical race theory was one of many theoretical approaches to legal analysis, and it fits very much within the category of lots of other approaches that have developed over the years, including law and economics, law and realism, law and literature, critical legal studies, to which it's very closely related, feminist jurisprudence, and a lot of other things. It's basically, the basic answer is what critical race theory? It's a theoretical approach to law and the impact of law on society. Various definitions, like anything else I think you could imagine, if you ask 20 different people who've been involved in critical race theory, they'd probably give you 20 different definitions for what it is. But I'm going to try to actually remember, for those of you who are remote, to shift to my PowerPoint so you can see what it is I'm talking about instead of my beautiful sort of obscure face. Okay, so one definition of critical race theory that I found in a book by two of the most prominent sort of founders or initiators of critical race theory, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic. And let me mention, I mentioned several of the scholars who are critical race theorists, and really it was kind of intentional to do so, not just to sort of pat them on the back or just because I knew them or I worked for them, and that's true about many of them. But because one of the things I think that's communicated about critical race theory is that it is solely a movement of black scholars or solely a movement of scholars of color. And one of the things that's been true about critical race theory from the beginning is that scholars of all racial backgrounds, all other kind of backgrounds and perspectives have been part of the movement. And so this is an example of Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic. Richard is Latino and Jean Stefancic is white, and they work together very closely and have for 30 years on these topics. And here's their definition for critical race theory. There's aspects of it that I love, and that's why I'm using it to start out with a short answer. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationships between race, racism, and power. Unlike traditional civil rights, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order. So all the things that I see in for my students, and we do spend a lot of time with PowerPoints, and you see me do this with the bold and italics. Those are the things about this definition that I really like, because as we'll see as we go through a little bit more of a longer form answer to this question. the things that really define critical race theory as distinguished from other theories of the law are the activist nature of the people who are involved, the fact that they see themselves as part of a movement to achieve something much beyond what happens inside legal academia, and that they see themselves as challenging traditional approaches to a range of things, including the way that people think about and have talked about the civil rights history of the country. And their challenging is not just about substance, it's also about style and approach. So another thing that really distinguishes the critical race theorists at the beginning and now is that they write in very different ways. Their approaches in terms of the kind of scholarship they write, the way they communicate, across the board is always very interesting and always very different. And it's an attempt to try to, among other things, rethink and reimagine what legal scholarship can be. Those are some of the things I always found particularly compelling about the approach. Okay, so 3 things I want to talk about quickly. It's origins, defining features, and critical race theory today. So, time frame, critical race theory basically started in the mid-1980s, and again that references me because I started law school in 1988. And so one of the reasons why this has had a personal impact on me is that timing. So the context, really sort of 3 things I want to mention about the context that I think are important. So in the late 70s, early 80s, after really a generation of people looking to the federal court system and seeing a progressive, sort of consistent and reliable sort of progress in terms of what were perceived to be race relations issues and civil rights issues with places like Brown and other cases that came forward in the 50s and 60s. After a long stretch of Republican presidents and therefore more conservative, quote-unquote, judicial appointments, that sort of reliance, that belief, that faith in the progressiveness of the federal courts had begun to stop and had begun to go in the other direction. There are various examples of cases that created that change, but the Bakke case in 1978 is a pretty significant example of it, which was the Supreme Court questioning seriously the constitutionality of affirmative action in admissions to higher education. So that's one part of the context. The second is a movement in the mid to late 70s called critical legal studies started to apply a very broad and significant criticism of the legal establishment and what was considered to be sort of mainstream legal views. And we could do a whole other session or 2 or 3 on critical legal studies, but it's enough for the purposes of this to say that the basic critique was that they challenged the inherent or the view that politics and political sort of activism was separate from legal analysis. Legal analysis was somehow this sort of pristine, pure scientific approach, and politics was something else, something to the side that shouldn't, that the 2 things shouldn't be connected and should be separated. And the critics, as they were called, the critical legal studies people said, that's crazy, that there's nothing in society that's like that. Legal analysis and legal doctrine isn't like that, so we challenge that. And it's fair to say that the critical race theory movement grew from the critical legal studies movement. In fact, when you think about just the terminology, I think the reason why it's called critical race theory, the word critical is referencing critical legal studies, as opposed to anything else in terms of that connection. Because what happened is the earliest sort of critical race theory theorists who saw themselves very closely associated with the critics were concerned that the critics talked too little and didn't focus enough on race, that they weren't addressing the dynamics of race as they affected the analysis. And for those of you who are politically involved or focused, it's not so different, I would think, than some of the critiques of sort of the Bernie Sanders campaign from people of color saying, it's great you're talking about class, it's great you're talking about poverty and all these issues, but we don't see enough of a focus on race in terms of what you're talking about, because race is still a significant thing separate from these things. And I think it was that same kind of dynamic that generated among the sort of critics who focused on race that maybe we want to separate ourselves and have a different sort of view, different sort of discussion. So, and then also other burgeoning progressive legal movements, feminist jurisprudence, and other things that were already happening at the time. Okay, so who? Basically, you've got professors and students. One of the things that's most compelling to me about the development of critical race theory is it really was a cooperative effort of law students and professors. And as a law student at the time, it feels kind of cool that we have been very little, trust me, very minorly involved in the way all this works. But another thing that the professors and students had in common, which I also think is a defining feature of critical race theory, is that they were all activists. The kind of people who got involved in critical race theory were the same people who were demonstrating on campus in the 50s and 60s, the kind of things that you may have seen in newsreels. I would say the kind of things your parents might have been involved in, but by now your parents are, well, they're my age now, so maybe their parents were involved in. And then more people in my generation. So the student protest movement in my generation focused on things like divestment from South Africa. That may sound like something that you wonder why that was controversial, but it was really controversial. And also a lot of movements towards having more educational programs and focus of issues beyond just sort of traditional focus on sort of white male discourse. So focuses on African American studies programs, or Asian American studies programs, or Latino studies programs. And that was the sort of thing that people in my generation were working on and had been demonstrating about and had been activists about in that time period. So that was the group of people who came together in this context at that time to help create this thing. Okay, so lots of folks can be looked to in terms of the who, but I did some research, because this is what I thought, but I did some research to make sure I wasn't wrong, and really the origin can be found in really one person, and that's Derek Bell. Derek Bell was the only graduate, the only black graduate of the University of Pittsburgh Law School in 1957. He served in the U.S. Army. He then worked at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. And after a while, I'm not sure if he told them or they found out that he was a member of the NAACP. And his bosses came to him and said, look, we think this is a conflict of interest. We have all kinds of cases with that organization, and you working here and being a member of that organization could be problematic. So you're going to have to either quit that organization or quit this job. And I think they were probably 99% sure he was going to quit the organization. But indicative of Derek Bell, he quit the job, and he went and worked for the NAACP for the Legal Defense Fund. So he handled some very important cases for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, sort of the second generation of cases after Brown versus Board of Education. But as we'll see, he became a little bit disillusioned. He began to see the sole focus of the LDF on integration, as opposed to broader issues and broader things that might be of importance to people of color, as a limit, as a restriction in terms of the work. He also began to see the victories that the NAACP had in their litigation strategy as not necessarily positively affecting the lives of people of color, at least not as much as people of color. So we have that dynamic. He worked there, disillusioned. He actually went to USC as a law professor, and then he was the first tenured black law professor at Harvard Law School, and that was 50 years ago this year, in 1971. And he wrote and taught, and this is the central sort of generating and formative insight, I think, that leads to the development of critical race theory. And basically, it was his notion of the convergence theory. And his argument was, you can point to almost any perceived advancement in civil rights and almost any perceived advancement in terms of the sort of the development and the quality of life of African Americans and other people of color as something that would not have happened but for an associated and related advancement and benefit to the broader mainstream white culture. So he talks about that in terms of Brown versus Board of Education, probably the first critical race theory article. The first thing you could really call a critical race theory article, he talks about Brown. He says, the real reason, or at least part of the reason for the Brown decision, was not some sort of new benevolent sense of race relations in the country, but that the political leaders and the leaders of the country saw it as significantly problematic that there was this segregation issue going on in the country, that they were fighting this Cold War with the Soviets in the world, and the Soviets were using American race-based segregation as a bludgeon against the United States when they were arguing to people in these different countries that whether or not you should sort of go with the Soviet Union or go with the United States. And he talks about how you have to understand and view that history that way, and if you do, it undermines the sense of the civil rights movement, as was the conventional wisdom, and to a certain extent still is this story of ongoing success and ongoing sort of positive development. So his challenge of that really forms the foundation of what we ultimately see as critical race theory. He then left Harvard to become dean of the University of Oregon Law School, but he resigned after an offer had been made to an Asian American potential faculty member, but the faculty did not vote to grant that offer. So basically, the dean's office had concluded that they wanted to hire an Asian person, but the faculty had rejected it, and so he resigned, and he went back to Harvard. And this is important sort of historically, because in this time period between when he was at Oregon and when he was at Harvard, there were no black professors at Harvard, and there was no one teaching these courses in race and American law that he had been teaching there for several years. And several students who either had known about him or had been his past students went to the university and said, is someone going to teach these classes? And apparently the university said, well, we don't really have anyone who's going to do it and wants to do it. So interestingly, they wrote, there was no email back then, so they wrote call professors that they knew or heard of around the country. And they got a lot of support from other faculty at Harvard, who usually the critics who supported them. And if you're a law student, you don't necessarily know who it is you're supposed to call at some law school 200 miles away to try to get to come to your school. So they got a lot of support. But they called a lot of folks and said, would you come help us? And basically, a group of law professors from around the country and the students worked together to create, essentially to redo and to teach the kind of courses that Professor Bell had been teaching. So when he came back to what was essentially this burgeoning movement of students and faculty from around the country that were sort of seeking to achieve the same things that he sort of tried to achieve. Two of the students who were instrumental in this, Kimberly Crenshaw and Mari Matsuda, are two of the absolutely founding members of critical race theory. In fact, it's hard to think of a founding member of critical race theory without mentioning Kimberly Crenshaw because she gave it its name. So one of the things after this class had been put together with the different people, they had a retreat at the University of Wisconsin, which was in 1989, which was when critical race theory got its name. And it was actually Kimberly Crenshaw who gave the name, again, associated with critical legal studies and trying to differentiate what they were doing. Okay, so here's a list of some of the founding members of critical race theory. I'm not going to go through them directly. You can take a look. Hopefully I can make this PowerPoint available to folks who want it. I wanted to put it up here in part to address another sort of impression of critical race theory I think that's being presented, which is that it's some fringe movement and it's this sort of radical thing from outside. These folks who started this movement were at the most sort of central and most sort of institutional places in the country, and they continue to be. Also, again, the notion that critical race theory is a movement of people of color, or particularly black people. The list of people on this list are from all racial backgrounds. Mari Matsuda is an Asian American woman of Japanese descent whose father fought in World War II in an all-Japanese regiment in Italy. Lonnie Guinier, who some of you may have heard of, because she was appointed to be Associate Attorney General, and this was another time in which critical race theory as a political issue came up. She is a mixed race person, she's a Jewish mother and an Afro-Latino father, Asian, indigenous, black. The people on this list are sort of all across the spectrum of what we have in terms of demographics in the United States. And I think it's important to note that critical race theory has always been sort of, the participants of it and the writers in it have been sort of as broadly viewed as this. Okay, so, me. I'm worried I've got to give my buddy some time. So, let's just say my entire law school life was sort of, if not defined by, affected by, and impacted by critical race theory. Starting with a course I took in the spring of my first year called Lawyering for Social Change, which was basically a course that critiqued what I had come to law school believing was the ideal, the foundation. I, like many students, certainly in my generation, went to law school because I wanted to be like Thurgood Marshall, I wanted to be like Charles Houston, I wanted to be the kind of person who changed the world through these big, high-impact legal cases. And this course, very much informed by the critical race theory movement, said maybe that's not the right approach. Maybe we should be focusing instead on trying to serve clients and to find out what their interests are. Not from on high saying, here's the cases and we're going to find people to be our plaintiffs, but going to people in the communities and saying, what is it that you need and how can we help you as lawyers? And I felt that was a very much sort of a defining feature of critical race theory. Common Minority Issues was a critical race theory class that I took with Charles Lawrence teaching it, who was a close associate of Derek Bell, and I then worked for him. I was a recent assistant for one of the first critical race theory articles about hate speech on campus, which was formative to me because it was the first work I ever did as a legal scholar that led to me standing up here as a profession. So Derek Bell did a protest. He did a hunger strike, actually, in 1989 at Harvard to try to convince a law school to hire women of color. And same sort of issue he had leading Oregon, but he did a hunger strike. We were very much involved, so the Balsa folks and the Balsa folks, Balsa was totally involved with the Balsa around the country, trying to support that, So I won't talk about Randy Kennedy, I won't talk about that one. So I did an internship at Legal Defense Fund, which was a place that Bell had worked, and I went to it with the kind of sense of all this that I'd had from my Lawyering for Social Change class, that it really impacted the way I thought about it. And then finally, I think most relevantly, certainly to me, I was never a big activist. I'm not really a critical race theorist, although it's really impacted me and I'm interested in it, but I was more likely to go pick up basketball after class than I was to go to meetings about activism. But one of my good friends said, would you come work with me in this organization that we're working on? I'm like, oh, what is it? It's like we want to promote, we want to try to encourage the law school to hire more people of color. And we're not exactly black people, whatever. We just want to diversify the fact that we think that's really important for a number of reasons. I said, okay. So working on that led me to understand a lot about the legal profession, led me to understand the real importance of diversity in the legal profession, which and that stuff I still don't know. Okay, so gonna do that longer do short. Okay, so defining features, quick. This is what makes critical race theory. First, legal scholarship as activism. One of the things that you see, I always thought of the first critical race theorists as activists who happened to be law professors as opposed to the other way. So they had been activists much of their lives, but now they were law professors and they were sort of looking around for a way for them to still be activists. And this was the way that they decided to do it, which I thought was kind of cool. Non-traditional scholarly approach, if you read critical race theory, one of the most famous critical race theory pieces by Derek Bell is actually a science fiction story called The Parable of the Sower. There are various other things. There are poems, there are sort of journals of people's. It's a very personal, very non-traditional way of doing legal scholarship. That's another thing that defines it. Rejection of conventional wisdom about civil rights, legal developments. I've already talked about that. That's this notion of the interest convergence theory. I won't do that again. Acknowledgement of systematic and permanent racial discrimination. That may be part of why we see critical race theory being used the way it's used. Professor Kevin is going to talk about. Because it certainly does argue, and again, this goes back to one of Professor Bell's earliest insights, that if we think about the history of America as there used to be racism, but there isn't racism anymore, that's very much what the critical race theory scholars were and are still trying to address and sort of undermine, because they believe there's still, and there, some say there will always be, some say that at least there's currently still is systematic racism, and they agree with that. Intersectionality is another defining feature which has grown. This is also Professor Crenshaw, who's at Columbia, who talked about how the dynamics and the way in which society legally impacts women of color is different, both than the way they impact women and the way they impact people of color. And that dynamic creates a third separate thing that isn't any one of those, isn't either of those two things combined. And that has been extended to queer theory and lots of other sort of things in terms of that same sense of intersectionality. Okay. Some other quotes about what people said about critical race theory. You don't really have to read these, but you can take a look at them. I'll pick one that I really like. Let's do the first one. Although critical race scholarship differs in object, argument, accent, and emphasis, it is nevertheless unified by two common interests. The first is to understand how a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of color have been created and maintained in America, and in particular to examine the relationship between that social structure and professed ideals such as the rule of law and equal protection. The second desire is not merely to understand the vexed bond between law and racist power, but to change it. And that quote doesn't come from me, that quote's from one of the books that I would recommend if you're interested in this that you look at, from Professor Crenshaw and several others, which is a compilation of different critical race theory scholarship. The reason why I like this quote is it addresses really the two main aspects of this. First, they are challenging the traditional notions, and traditional notions both from conservatives and liberals of the history of the civil rights development in the country. And second, they're not just challenging it from some sort of antiseptic, idealistic, ivory tower legal approach. They're challenging it as activists because they want to see actual, concrete, measurable change for the people that they care about in their work. So that's the answer to the first question, what critical race theory is. I got a critical race theory today. I'm going to not do that because I'm going to give some time to my colleague. And I also have here a very brief reading list. Again, if anyone's interested in this, the last message I want to give is don't believe what we say about this. Don't believe what you might hear other people say about this. Make up your own mind. You're here in law school. What we want you to do is to think for yourselves. And we're giving you our perspective. We hope you listen. But if you're interested in this, one way or the other, from whatever political approach you have, read this stuff and make your own choice. Make your own decision about the impact that it has. And I think that's all any of us could ever hope that you guys do, as your professors and the people at school. So with that, I will thank you, and I will hand it off to Professor.
So when you give a public presentation, you're normally supposed to thank people for being there, and you always hear that, and frankly, I don't know that we always mean it, but I mean it today. Thank you for being here. I think that your presence and your attention to the issues that we're discussing matters. I really mean that. So why is a middle-aged, dumpy white guy who has never been subjected to racism, who's absolutely benefited from privilege, and who can look around the room and know in a nanosecond that there are numerous people with way more personal knowledge and experience as to these issues speaking here today? I don't know. Because I asked you. It's uncomfortable. And I'm uncomfortable. The best justification I can offer is that I know a little bit about law, a little bit about politics, and that when it comes to matters of race, I care. And I want you to care a lot about these issues. So I've divided my remarks today into really 3 different parts, and they are really distinct. So it'll be a little difficult to keep track of where we are, but I want you to give you a little roadmap first. First, I'm going to talk about some historical, political context for why we're talking about this today. Second, we're going to discuss why it is that we are actually here having a conversation about critical race theory, the insidious reason why we are. And then I'm going to talk third and finally about the reason why, even though it's not the reason that we are talking about critical race theory today, we should be nonetheless. So just to make things a little more uncomfortable than they already are, we start with a topic I know almost as little as I know about race: sex. So, now that I have your attention, opposition to sex education in the 1970s was a powerful political weapon. School boards were turned into cauldrons based on opposition to sex ed. The opposition for some of the opponents was real. They were genuinely scared. But for most of the people who were pushing the opposition to sex ed, the opposition to sex ed was a means to other ends. Smut, immorality, a path to a communist country. Those are all direct, actual quotes from the campaigns against sex education. We laugh now at the idea that sex ed could lead to communism. It seems absurd here in the moment now. But would we have laughed and would we have recognized the absurdities then, at that time, in the present, when other people were telling us what to think? The strategy propelled, among many others, our prior actor-turned-president to the California governorship. It was a short-term political success. And in his case, it launched a long-term political dynasty. The tactic of playing to fear worked. The tactic of playing to fear generally does work in politics. Long term, it hurt real people. It exacerbated the AIDS crisis. It led to all manner of unintended sexual struggles. And we can say now, without equivocation, that it was the wrong side of history. Did the political ends justify the means? Fast forward to 1988, and one of the most notorious political advertisements in history. A dark, black man. Dark imagery of a revolving door. Mugshots. dog whistle narration and tone. The message, be afraid. Be very afraid. Be afraid, fear the black man. One of us will protect you, the suburban white affluent voter, from the black man. The other of us is on his side. But as Professor Niles wisely just told you, don't take our word for it. In fact, at the time, the campaign manager for that 1988 presidential election, one of the most successful political operatives in American history, Lee Atwater, he bragged about the strategy. By the time we're finished, they're going to wonder whether Willie Horton is Dukakis running mate. The campaign was so successful, the fear tactics were so successful, not just in producing the short-term electoral win, but they led to a series of decades of regressive criminal justice policies. And in fact, those policies were so successful, or those policies were failures. That campaign was so successful at creating fear that the policies you see reflected, and note just how close it is to 1988, where that incredible spike occurs, were often bipartisan in nature. Because the Democrats didn't only lose to the Willie Horton campaign, they ended up embracing many of the systemically unjust policies that have led to incarceration nation. In other words, short term, the strategy worked. But it hurt real people. And long term, is there really any question that it was the wrong side of history to use people as pawns to lead to a scenario where the United States has a prison population that is 1/20th of the world prison population? Long term, it was the wrong side of history. You might be sensing the theme. 2004, opposition to same-sex marriage just happened to coincidentally be on the ballot in 11 states. Turnout in all 11 of the states where the same-sex marriage bans were on the ballot went up in every single state relative to 2000. Which, by the way, was a closely contested and very much up in the air presidential election, 2000. Turnout spiked. All 11 bans were approved overwhelmingly, as high as 86% in favor of banning same-sex marriage in some states. But in addition to state-specific dynamics, Ohio embodied the national electoral impact of those bans. In Ohio, George W. Bush won 51% of the vote. Those of you who paid attention to politics that long ago when you were just children, but at least your parents will remember all the way through Election Day. John Kerry was working the phone. Bruce Springsteen held concerts right up until the day before the election in Ohio. Ohio was the focus. There's an old saying. It's no longer really true, but the old saying used to be, as goes Ohio, so goes the nation. 51% was the lowest margin that Bush got in any significant state. That's how closely competitive it was. And without those 20 electoral votes, John Kerry would have been the president. Well, what happened in Ohio in 2004, just like in any state in an election, is an aggregation of lots of small, little, granular portions. And if you look at the numbers, in 2004, Bush increased his share relative to an already strong share of the vote in 2000 among these two groups most dramatically. In a close election, 17% and 12%, enormous. In other words, short term, the strategy of hateful opposition to love worked. Long term, it hurt real people. And you can say, well, yeah, but it all ended well, right? Because we have it now. For some people, that dream deferred dried up like a raisin in the sun before they had a chance. It was the wrong side of history. But by far and away, the most constant, recurring, and yes, contemporary wedge issue in America has always been race. And there are so many points of departure where we could talk about. We could start in 1492. We could start in 1619. We could start in 1861. Or we could try and tell a happy story and start in 1964, the signing of the Civil Rights Act, which is absolutely a bright spot, but which also absolutely gave rise to the political realities that we're dealing with today in both positive and negative ways. Which is why LBJ, himself a Texan, who knew a little bit about the South, it's why he lamented as he signed that seminal piece of legislation, there goes the South for a generation. Not one single word that he said in that regret proved wrong, except this. His only mistake was underestimating for how many generations it would be gone. And in 2020, maybe the state of Georgia represents a little purpleizing, if you will. But the reality is, electorally, opposition to race was the thing. And 50 years later, it remains the thing. But in the interest of time, let's not use those points of departure. Let's jump forward to matters, experiences that you've had personally, that you've lived through. You remember the birther controversy? The incessant claim that the first black president wasn't, really a real American. It was never true. But damn, it resonated. It really resonated with certain groups. And the birther controversy that wasn't the controversy, except it was made to be a controversy for political ends, launched a political juggernaut. Tapping into Otherism, bolstered a man whose very slogan reassured whites who needed to believe, after America elected a black man, that America could be, after that travesty, made great again. The birther controversy, the messaging that he's not one of us, was just the beginning of the otherism. Impoverished immigrants, it's an invasion. They are coming. It's a crisis. Build that wall. They are coming. They are rapists. They're not bringing their best. They. Voter suppression, including directly at the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court and so-called judicial minimalists who like to claim when the legislative outputs are consistent with their priors, that they believe the legislature should decide these questions. But when Congress assembles an 11,000-page record and reauthorizes the Voting Rights Act, including by a margin of 98-0 in the Senate in 2006, Justice Scalia and John Roberts and Sam Alito and their crew, they get together and they huddle, and based on their expertise, they decide America isn't racist anymore. And even more offensive, Antonin Scalia has the audacity to say in the Supreme Court that the Voting Rights Act is a racial entitlement. I thought I knew a little about voting rights, but I must have missed the part where it gave extra votes. Like if you're black, you get 2 votes. It's an entitlement. Or maybe it just gave you equal access that you'd long been denied by states with a history of discrimination. Blatantly discriminatory travel bans. Overlap with religion, not strictly just race, but we know that there's a race overlap there too. Peaceful protesters of systemic injustice, of the killings at the hands of the state of innocent black people. What are they? Sons of bitches. Meanwhile, literal Nazis, swastika waving, Confederate flag waving, Klan members who commit homicide in Charlottesville. Well, you know, there were good people on both sides. You want to talk about the height of hypocrisy? Floating the idea of an executive order to ban birthright citizenship. Never mind that it's literally unconstitutional in every way, shape, or form. That the text of the 14th Amendment could not be clearer when it says just what it says on the screen. But just like Mexico paying for the wall, it didn't matter if there was any truth to it. What mattered is that this was another way to get the attention, to remind people about the others. And that the person you want to go to for the non-others, the us's, you know who that is. The question, though, that was maybe illustrated better than ever in the year 2020 is, are we playing by the same rules? Are there the same rules for men dressed up for Halloween cosplay with guns that were not fake, trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan in the Capitol building? And protesters for systemic injustice against black people? Don't take my word for it that there are different rules. I found somebody to say it better. She said it better directly to Attorney General Barr in this clip.
So the point I'm trying to make here, Mr. Barr, that I think is very important for the country to understand, is that there is a real discrepancy in how you react as the Attorney General, the top cop in this country, when white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns. There is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president.
Did it work? Did the fear tactics work? You better believe that from a short-term political perspective they work. In 2016, this is a county-by-county map of the white vote in the 2016 presidential election. You better believe the tactics work. And you better believe that in 2020 they would have worked again. And really effectively they did, just not quite well enough to overcome an historic, incomprehensibly incompetent response to a deadly pandemic, which frankly, from a political perspective, was the ultimate layup that was missed. All he had to do was bring a scintilla, a modicum of seriousness, somber, come together, this is a serious moment for the country, people are dying, response. And when I say he would have won, think of it this way. Look how close it was. He would have not only won because of the fear tactics, without this, he wins in a landslide. So that's historic context. Why are we talking about this today? There are a couple reasons. There's a small reason, there's a big reason. One, the small reason is that 2 weeks ago in this very room, there was an insult to intelligence, a preposterous, insulting, offensively bad, beneath the law school event. And an event, by the way, where they refused to allow for another side. The speaker didn't want that. So in some level, this is a micro response. But more importantly, we're talking about it because what happened in this room is just a carbon copy of what's happening around America everywhere. School districts, the media. We're talking about critical race theory today, not for the reasons, the erudite, thoughtful reasons of Professor Niles. We're talking about it because hell hath no fury like an aggrieved white person. And even better, a white parent. Statistically, virtually no one in the country had heard of critical race theory just 6 months ago. Virtually no one, statistically. It was the niche academic corner that Professor Niles correctly and quite well described. You know what that made it? It made it the perfect boogeyman. Because just like the boogeyman that you were supposed to be afraid of when your parents told you not to be out in the neighborhood late at night, it didn't really exist, but it was scary, and you knew that the unknown is scary to all of us on some level, and besides, it was dark. So it could be defined for you. Critical race theory is a term that is being defined for other people as the boogeyman. Meet Christopher Ruffa. Looks like a nice guy. Christopher Ruffa is credited with the Trump executive order that banned the teaching of diversity, equity, and inclusion materials in the federal government. But more importantly, he's the guy, credit to him, who seized on the term critical race theory as the ultimate opportunity for a wedge issue in 2022, which is effectively the year we're in, by the way. And what's he say? He's got a strategy. We're going to take the term critical race theory, and we are going to brand it, and we are going to make it toxic. He will win that war. He is winning that war. That war, sadly, at least in the near term, is over. But it's only just beginning. Because he's been amplified by a network of conservative organizations and deeply deep pockets, the Billionaire Coke Network, KOCH, the Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, Fox News. And they are in on this hook, line, and sinker. The strategy is working. And 2 weeks ago, what happened in this room was just one of a zillion data points in executing that playbook to a T. Paid mercenary, filling their calendars and their wallets at the hands of disadvantaging yet further the people who've been disadvantaged throughout our entire history. This chart is unbelievable, and yet so believable. This issue didn't even exist on the radar a few months ago. In June, it was mentioned 901 times, critical race theory, on Fox News in June alone. That's not by accident. In fact, just like Lee Atwater back with Willie Horton, it's not, don't take my word for it that it's not by accident, they're bragging about it. They're bragging about it and saying that this issue, which realistically I'd barely even heard of. 6 months ago, a year ago, I'd heard of Kimberly Crenshaw. I heard Derek Bell speak one time, incredible speaker. I'd read a little bit, but honestly, it's not my area. Critical race theory wasn't being taught in the schools. Barely even taught in the law schools. That's going to be the center of the 2022 campaigns. Ask yourself if that's because it's actually the center of the campaigns or because it's being manufactured to be actually the center of the 2022 campaigns. But it's not just talk. Because when you've got all the money and all the resources and all the organizations at your disposal, you can channel that talk into action. And think about just how recent the trend lines were. And yet already, as of June, this is legislation banning talking about race honestly in our schools. Making you scared that that's going to make your kid hate America. Really, in a sense, what they want to do is to protect the children, right? And what better way to protect them than the bubble wrap of those nice little fantasy stories that we all grew up on in our so-called history books. Like the ones where the Pilgrims and the Native Americans got together and dressed up in cute outfits and some dined at table, as opposed to the genocide. Because I got a pretty good sense of which one was more meaningful and which one we spend more time on. The fantasy is nice. The strategy is clear, though. Anytime systemic racism, systemic discrimination is pointed to by anyone, the maneuver, is to turn around and say that that person who's pointing to systemic discrimination is calling you racist. But again, don't take my word for it. Just last week, we got a clip. And while you watch the clip, know this. Ted Cruz is many things, but dumb is not one of them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with a question for each of the 5 witnesses. In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist? Professor Tolson.
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have...
You're asserting that. What's your evidence for that?
The federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is, but...
So everyone in Texas is racist. Good on Professor Tolson, by the way, for getting right in there and calling him on the maneuver. So you're saying everyone in Texas is a racist? Sir, I think that's pretty reductive. Ask yourself this question. If you're in a conservative echo chamber, or if Ted Cruz said that same thing, did that same thing on Fox News, or if the speaker who stood here 2 weeks ago and denied that these things can be discriminatory without everyone in the system being racist. Ask yourself if on Fox News you're going to get that interjection that says, no, I'm not saying everyone in Texas is racist. I'm saying that this law, which was passed with the intention of reducing the impact of certain voters of color, and actually has the impact in addition to the intent, that's racist. Your job, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to be the person who challenges that kind of absurd claim. Speaking of reductive, if honest discussions of race are not anti-American, you know what is anti-American? The Confederate flag, literally anti-American. And just this year, proudly displayed in the halls of the U.S. Congress, as part of what? Oh, something else that's anti-American. An attempt to overthrow the government, an insurrection. An attempt to deprive the will of the people in a free and fair election. And you're hearing all this about critical race theory, and you know what the Kardashians wore to the grocery store. But you know, you probably don't recognize those documents in the top right there. The one with just the boring white text. It makes a terrible PowerPoint image. That's a 6-point plan, authored by John Eastman. We just learned about it about 10 days ago. That 6-point plan was the legal strategy to overturn the election. It was the legal strategy behind January 6th. Who's John Eastman? Leader in the Federalist Society, prominent law professor, former dean, advisor to the president. Part of the legal team that perpetuated for the last however many months it is since the election, the big lie that somehow the election was not free and fair. Funny how every single time that was tried before a neutral fact finder it failed. You know what's anti-American? Overthrowing the government of America. But it's working. Branding critical race theory, it is working like you can only imagine. Most Americans still haven't heard of it. But it's only 2021. And among those who have heard the term critical race theory, the opinions are sharply negative, which should come as no surprise because it's been defined as the boogeyman. 85% of Republicans have a sharply negative view of it. Got to play the base, but really, the more important stat there is 71% of independents have an unfavorable view of critical race theory. Now, realistically, they've never heard Professor Niles tell you what it really is. But they know from the Ruffa strategy that any discussion of race is under the umbrella of this term that we have now had defined for us. 71% of independents. A group, by the way, that largely voted for President Trump in 2016 and largely swung to President Biden in 2020. That's why we're talking about it. It's already produced political wins. But this is the current Congress. And I know a midterm election is just a midterm. We don't have to get excited. You know, it's just a midterm. No. 50-50 in the Senate. Narrow division in the House. Add into the House historical trends for incumbent presidents losing seats in the House in a midterm election. Add to that the first election after gerrymandering and redistricting following the 2020 census. Add to that the fact that the 2020 census was itself manipulated to suppress certain categories of people. Even though we say we're going to count all the people. So this is why you're suddenly being told, and you will be told for the next 13 months, I guarantee you, that the most important thing facing America today is the idea that a kid in a school somewhere will be taught something other than the fairy tale when it comes to race. Because believe me, even if you think it's just the midterm, these guys don't. Mitch McConnell, I can assure you, does not think it's just a midterm. Stephen Breyer is many things. Young is not one of them. You remember in March of 2016, when America's first black president wasn't accorded the courtesy of his Supreme Court nominee even having a hearing. What was the argument? Well, it's an election year. Let the voters decide. March, the last I checked, is earlier in the calendar than September. Somehow the 2016 principle didn't apply to the nominee in 2020 when Justice Ginsburg died in September. Yeah, they think it matters. They think that matters because of many things. This is just one of them. I'm going to come back to the wires in a moment, but I put this here because I want you to think about this as a metaphor for the next couple of minutes. And the next couple of minutes are tough. This is now part 3. Why are we talking about this? Or we've covered. Now, why we should be talking about it, even though it's not the reason why we are. And I want you to think as a metaphor that each one of those wires, we've all got a drawer like that somewhere, right? Each one of those in the tangle represents a strand. One small aspect of our legal systems and structures. Housing, health care, education, criminal justice, taxes, on and on and on. Those are just a few. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to ask you to multitask. The multitasking is this. Unlike most of the time with PowerPoint, the slides that you're about to see are going to go by way faster than you could possibly be expected to process them. And I'm not going to be talking about what's on the slides. They're just data points. Because the data points are intended to show you, while making another point, that the evidence for systemic racism in America is overwhelming. The objective data, overwhelming. And each one of those little aspects is a strand. So, paid charlatans like the one who was here 2 weeks ago, who I know from many of you telling me hurt some of you, in some cases deeply. They want to assert, as he did, that systemic racism is, and I quote, rubbish. That it is pushed by the Marxist Democrat left. And who then point to their evidence in support of their claim. It's a law school, right? Gotta support with evidence. For support of the claim that systemic racism doesn't exist, he pointed, and I kid you not, if you weren't in the room, you're going to think I'm exaggerating this. As evidence that systemic racism doesn't exist in America, well, look at Denzel and Oprah. They don't need to win in court. They aren't subject to the rules of evidence. Theirs is a battle for hearts and minds. So they play to fear, and they play to telling you what is patriotic and what is anti-American. So here we go, and now's your multitasking moment. Systemic racism does not mean that everyone in the system is racist. In fact, it means exactly the opposite. It means that even apart from actual intended racism by actual racists, we have systems and institutions that produce racially discriminatory impact. Subjectively, we can admit that, or we can deny it. But the objective facts in a world where facts used to mean something are clear. Systemic racism means that on the one hand, When it comes to housing, let's say, what started as years of legalized segregation that then became years of racially restrictive covenants, that then became years of NIMBY, not in my backyard, opposition to affordable housing, that even though those things were framed now, or are framed now, as race neutral, they're not race neutral in impact at all. Systemic racism means that when vast sums of wealth are concentrated in the hands of the white population, much of that passed down for generations, some of it built on the backs of people of color, that seemingly boring, banal tax policies that dramatically favor capital relative to labor are not race neutral in impact at all. So this is a law school. Lochner was formally overruled. The one else in the room haven't heard of Lochner yet, but you will. Though overruled, you can rest assured that Lochnerism is alive and well in America today. Which is to say that laissez-faire, hands off, the market will solve the problems. When the little 13-year-old baker boy is trying to negotiate with the big bakery owner, he's going to be able to negotiate for fair terms because freedom of contract. New York shouldn't tell them that they can't actually negotiate for a 100-hour week with unsafe working conditions, right? That would be big regulation. If you remember not one other sentence from what I uttered today, remember this one. When you start with baseline inequity, and you layer on top of baseline inequity neutrality, you don't get neutral results. You get a perpetuation of the baseline that was itself unequal. Neutrality layered on top of unequal baselines is not neutral at all. But the powerful proponents of the status quo don't want to address things in that way. And so, let there be zero doubt. Their strategy is working. It's already producing political wins. It will produce bigger political wins. But now you'll hear a lot about colorblindness from the opponents of critical race theory. Because colorblindness is, in addition to a fiction, because we all see color. And the question is whether we want to choose to see that color and find beauty in it. Colorblindness fits with the narrative that neutrality is in fact neutral. When neutrality is anything but neutral when we start from unequal baselines. Professor Yaroshevsky posted this the other day and I stole it from her.
She stole it from someone, it's okay.
This entire thing, by the way, is one huge copyright violation, but that's a different class. The message is clear. The guy with all the cookies says to the guy with one cookie, resent this guy who wants a cookie, who just so happens to be dark-skinned, and maybe from another place. Like, say, hypothetically, where in one of the slides you may or may not have processed, the state of Montana is refusing to allow 78 Afghan citizens, refugees, who helped the United States for the last 20 years and put themselves at risk. Why? Because they don't share our culture and values. This room is packed. We could fit 78 more people in here if we really had to. I think there's room for them in Montana. Last point. As part of the colorblindness trope, and it's perhaps the most offensive of the aspects of this incredibly offensive political fear machine, the proponents, the manufacturers of the fear, have started to use Martin Luther King. They started by picking the one single quote that they know, or that they want to know, from what Dr. King said. It is one that I hope every single person in this room loves. I know I do. Right? The idea that we should all want, we should dream of a day when people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character? Absolutely. They're using that to promote colorblindness, to promote neutrality. But don't take my word for it again. That's Martin Luther King's daughter 5 days ago. The fear-mongering regarding critical race theory is aimed at banning teaching substance on the past and current devastation of white supremacy and racism. She knows what's up. And just last night, I don't know exactly what time yesterday she tweeted it, but my RAs can verify that I texted them at about 9:30 last night, doing one last kind of check on what's going on in the world of critical race theory and the machine that tells us to be afraid. And just yesterday, she tweeted this. My father was a drum major for justice, not for a colorblind society. There's a vast difference. And using him to advance the opposite of what he stood for, that's offensive on top of the offensive. The chords are in a nasty tangle. The powerful people don't want you to understand that against a backdrop of staggering injustice, the cords aren't going to untangle themselves. The cords got into that tangle through facilitated structures, through law, through policy, through action and inaction. And the question is, maybe if we just pick them all up at once, maybe they'll just untangle themselves magically. But that's not been my experience. Not being a racist is the lowest of the low-hanging fruit. You're not a racist? Great. You want a cookie? Because I suggest that rather than a cookie, you should grab an oar and start paddling. The question isn't, are you a racist? The question is, just like the question was with sex ed, just like the question was with same-sex marriage, with hateful opposition to real love, just like the questions were in areas we didn't cover, like opposition to teaching evolution. The question is, are you going to recognize now, when you're in the present moment, how absurd this is going to look in a few years? But for those of you who are suffering the hurt that comes with all of this packaging, because the theme plays itself out through and through, the tactics will work, real people, some in this room, will be hurt, and long-term, it will be the wrong side of history. The question is, are you going to recognize it now while you're in it? That's the question. So I have no idea if I should be standing here and giving this talk. But I want you to know, especially, but not solely, the people of color in the room, I see you, I feel you, and I want to be right there with you. And I hope that everyone else in the room wants to be right there with you, too. Because the cords aren't going to untangle themselves. And our legal structures, our Supreme Court, our Congress, our legislature, not only are they not going to do it, they're going to try and do the opposite. So, good for you, you're not a racist. But we got some work to do. And I say we get on with it.